Good morning. Give it a couple more minutes for people to trickle in. Paul, you weren't late at all.
Oh, I still have to eat my sandwich, but I wanted to make sure that screen sharing was enabled. I see you've already done it though.
Yeah, I think we did it at the exact same time.
Like two horses in a harness.
Exactly. Give it just one more minute. All right, Donald, I think you have our first item today. Take it away.
Hey, hi everyone. Let me share. Okay, can you see my share?
Yes, looks great.
Okay, so hi, I'm Donald Hunter, and I work at Red Hat, and in collaboration with some IBM research colleagues, and I think Etai is on the call as well. We're exploring a number of hybrid cloud use cases, I suppose is the best way, the umbrella to describe them. And I think all of these use cases start to strain the definition of a cluster set, the way it's currently defined in the MCS spec, and certainly, I think, break the concept of namespace sameness. So just kind of as an outset, I'll describe a little bit of the motivation of what we're trying to achieve, and then talk about some of the challenges I think we face with the current MCS spec as it stands. I'll give you a little bit of detail about some of just sketch out the way it looks from the perspective of a number of use cases, and then just kind of move on to at least sharing some ideas about proposals for moving forward. And at any point, please do ask questions. I'm interested to hear what conversations have happened in this space before and what may have led to existing MCS decisions, and whether or not what we're talking about makes sense in the context of MCS. Okay, so from a motivation perspective, I think one of the key points that we've started to explore with hybrid clouds is that we need autonomy for multiple DevOps teams to carry out the way they're already functioning with single clouds and with multiple clouds or multiple clusters, where they potentially have deployment namespaces that have already been allocated to them. They want to operate within those namespaces. They only potentially have access to one or two of a set of clusters in a hybrid cloud, and other DevOps teams may be responsible for things that happen in other clusters. And so there's a need for DevOps teams to cooperate on the exporting and importing of of services between clusters in the hybrid cloud. And that to an extent means there's potentially not the possibility of aligning on namespace, and there's a degree of asymmetry to what's going on. And I think another aspect of the motivation of we're looking at is once we start to think of a large number of teams operating inside a shared hybrid cloud, that there's a need for selective sharing rather than blanket sharing when we talk about exporting services from clusters that we don't necessarily want to import and make available everywhere. And we want to enable seamless growth from existing kind of brownfield environments where we start to link together existing deployments, existing cluster deployments, and start sharing between them. So from what we understand, what I understand of the MCS capabilities at the moment, this bumps up against a number of limitations, is the way I see it. Is the cluster set's really defined as a homogeneous cloud, and sharing is blanket across the cluster set with namespace sameness assumed and possibly even required within the cluster set. I'm not sure if I would go as far as saying it's required, but it's certainly assumed.
So there's a little nuance to both of those points, the way we've been talking about it. So I don't think a cluster set is a homogeneous cloud. Like, yes, namespace sameness is required, but that doesn't mean that the namespace needs to be in every single cluster. It just means that for the clusters it's in, it's treated the same. The same can be that in all the clusters it's in, the namespace is not multi-cluster aware. What we don't want is a situation where a namespace means one thing in clusters A and B and a different thing in clusters C and D, because that makes it really hard to reason about. It's totally fine that a namespace would be in every cluster and mean a different thing in each cluster, so long as they are basically cluster local namespaces, or that a namespace wouldn't exist in a significant portion of clusters. That's absolutely fine too. The reasoning for that is just, when you're basically building anything that knows about clusters, we don't have a lot of tools for identification. Namespace is a very strong one. And so there's no nice, clean way that we've been able to come up with to have, subsets of clusters have namespaces that mean one thing, but other namespaces that overlap, and it starts getting really confusing. And I think if we talk about that partial trust model where you would just want to export some things, like maybe it's better if these environments are actually viewed as potentially different cluster sets, and we use something like the Gateway API to expose services between them instead, so that you're not kind of opting into that trust model. Like maybe MCS and the friendly nature of a cluster set is not the best tool then, and treating those remote clusters as like external consumers might be an easier path in terms of management. That's kind of the thinking in the background.
Okay, that's useful to know.
Donald, sorry, this is Tom. So from past discussions, it seems that, or from what I recall, is what you're trying to achieve is that the namespace for the cluster may be named differently in different clusters, but is it true that it's still like actually the same logical entity, but it may be named differently?
I'm not sure it's as simple as making that statement, no. I think one of the challenges that we're encountering, or we're thinking or exploring, is in a brownfield environment where you've got clusters that you want to incorporate into a hybrid cloud. In other words, you want private trust between those clusters, rather than having to expose things publicly for interconnect. There's a high degree of chance of namespace overlap, which you need to deal with. So I'll go through some of the kind of consequences of at least the motivation as we see it, and see see where the discussion goes, I guess, is a useful way to go forward from here. So from a use case perspective, there's a number of use cases which I think you could probably solve if you had control over how you define namespaces in order to satisfy the use cases with the current MCS model. Consuming services provided by other teams, growing services into other clusters. And to the point you mentioned there, Jeremy, I think the private sharing is one that can probably be resolved just by being selective about what namespaces exist in what clusters. And then the idea of migrating services as well, which involves, building a namespace and moving a service and plumbing it back into the original location where the service is consumed, are all kind of use cases that we're exploring for hybrid cloud that seem to bump against the current defined scope of MCS. So just going through each of these in a little bit more detail, I think it helped me to frame, the administrative boundaries that exist, the challenges when existing namespaces and existing workloads exist. So for example, here, there's a published service provided by a different team in a different namespace that I want to consume into my existing namespace by my existing workloads that I deploy in my DevOps process. And without asking either me to redeploy into a new namespace or the other team to deploy into a new namespace, we have a namespace difference that needs to be resolved. It is the simplest case that I can think of from a use case perspective. Another example where I want to grow my service into a new workspace or into a new cluster to get more capacity. Yes, I probably could arrange to deploy a namespace that matches my existing workload namespace, but I need to do it in such a way that the originating namespace, I would prefer not to have to redeploy my application to be able to consume something that is both provided in my local and in remote namespaces. I don't know if this is something that MCS can achieve today, but it's something that we certainly want to try and achieve. And related to this is just migrating a service to a remote cluster and then consuming it in the originating cluster without change from the originating cluster's perspective.
That first use case is actually something that MCS mostly supports today. We did make the decision to require a change from the service, changing the service name from cluster.local to clusterset.local, just so there was no accidental changeover. Like basically as a consumer, you opt in. Yeah. But aside from that, yes, you can absolutely spread the service across as many clusters as you want.
Yeah, I think the opt-in to DNS naming or service advertisement is potentially one of the challenges. It feels like you have to reconfigure and redeploy your workloads in order to consume something that has moved, which would be, if that was a control choice on MCS, I think that would be a useful thing to consider.
That's a good point. It also just mechanically gets difficult because your DNS implementation may be different for multi-cluster than for single cluster. But also to be clear, it's entirely possible that you just deploy your service consuming the multi-cluster from the start, and it's just deployed in your local cluster. That's kind of like what we might recommend it for future compatibility. Like, just use cluster set if you are interested in the multi-cluster world.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, so configure from the outset for multi-cluster, even if you're in single cluster. Yeah, and a related use case, and this is more to do with selective sharing rather than namespace sameness. But I think from what you've said already, selective sharing is just a case of making sure you don't have. But then there's the flip side of that. You don't want to accidentally share to namespaces just because there is a namespace overlap. So we need that's something we need to be aware of.
Jeremy, I had one question on the DNS thing that you just mentioned. So let's say I have an existing service which is not using cluster set local as the DNS, right? and I want to access it from within my cluster set. Now, are we saying that the scope of MCS will always be that such a service is an external service? Or would the scope of MCS want to include having this service be part of the cluster set services? Because I do not want to use a north-south proxy for whatever reason.
Right.
Or are we saying that you must use a north-south proxy for anything that is not in cluster set local?
Okay, so sorry, I just want to kind of recap. So you have a service that you're consuming cluster local, and you do want it to be exposed to others?
No, not cluster local. I mean, it's the enterprise has a service that I'd like to consume. It's an existing service that I'd like to consume from a cluster set.
Oh, then that service, that existing service could be exported. It doesn't impact the existing service at all. Like, so MCS is entirely additive, right? So in whatever service that's exporting that service, or whatever cluster that's exporting that service, it would still be available as cluster.local, no change. But by exporting it, now it becomes available elsewhere as cluster set.local. If you wanted to consume it from outside of the cluster set, then you'd need a gateway. But within the cluster set, you would just need to, make sure that the namespace, the corresponding namespace exists for import.
Well, that's my point. If I want to consume an external service without going through a north-south gateway, is that something we want to target with MCS? I want to consume a external service without going through a north-south gateway.
External to the cluster set?
Yes, for now.
MCS is only concerned with in cluster set.
So that really, I guess we are limiting the scope of MCS, which is sort of in the same vein as some of the use cases that Donald is talking about, right? Brownfield services, connecting to brownfield services and all will have to be done through an external proxy. And
well, or you can create, services that represent them. Like, you're right, this doesn't solve all those use cases. I'm not really sure it necessarily should. I think, at some point, like, the Kubernetes API is incredibly powerful and you can do whatever you want with it. The set of things we can easily automate and make trivial needs to have some kind of bounds. I think, MCS, we could potentially extend it to support like importing services from other environments that have no cluster set awareness. I'm not necessarily opposed to that. I think that would need to be add-on and also very careful, because the other thing is that we try to make MCS too powerful and the surface gets massive. It's no longer easy to use. And it's really hard to actually get approved. I see this comment from Liwen from about making HTTP route from gateway API and multi-cluster set aware. Actually, the gateway API is supposed to be able to support pointing at a service import. So you can just put a gateway in front of an MCS exported service. So that's an option.
Yeah, I guess here's the thing, right? If team A wants to provide a service that multiple teams in the enterprise want to consume, today, the options are either you would have to put all these teams into one cluster set, right? You can't have separate cluster sets consuming a common service except through a north-south gateway.
Correct.
So do we want to extend MCS to include that is really the crux of it? Or are we sure we do not want MCS to go there?
I don't want to close that door.
It is a way of saying what you're saying, Sanjeev, cluster set bridging.
Yes, because, in a manner of speaking, it's a cluster set bridge, or, there would be services that are common to the enterprise that lots of cluster sets would want to consume. today, the option as MCS is defined today would be either put everybody in the same cluster set and everybody has to coordinate namespaces, or this service is exposed as an external service, not as an MCS service, but through a north-south API with its own DNS and its own URL, right? So,
Well,
but
I mean, I think we need a URL. We need its own URL. Like if it's not going to be part of the cluster set and it doesn't want to opt into sameness, it needs to provide its own identity, right? Like, so I want to be clear too. Like, support with, I think the gateway API is the right answer here. It's also a very flexible API, and perhaps this. So, I mean, we're definitely getting hypothetical right now, and I do think this needs more discussion, but perhaps that service is not actually exported through a north-south proxy. There's just another kind of gateway class that injects a service that looks like an MCS service. Like there's a middle ground there. Like the gateway API, I think, is often used for proxy configuration, but we can do other things with it. It doesn't need to just, front a load balancer. But I think the gateway is the correct concept, I think, for describing the bridge between these two otherwise unrelated cluster sets.
Yeah, and if you're talking about using gateway with essentially L4 service exposure, not L7
right
load balancing.
And it does have that. There is a TCP and UDP route.
In which case it can be used even for cluster set services then why not use it for even cluster set services?
Trying to understand the benefit of actually using MCS instead of always using a gateway.
Well, how would you, the use case above, how you stitch a service that actually spans multiple clusters together, you need some concept for that. Gateway doesn't have. Actually, it does. It's MCS. So yeah, gateway lives above MCS, right? MCS is just literally stretching the service object across clusters. It's not clever. If you want any configuration, if you want traffic shaping, traffic splitting, advanced routing, any L7 capabilities, gateway is the answer to all of those, and it would live above MCS. MCS just says these two services are in these two clusters, and I want them to be considered the same service by anyone who can consume them.
So Jeremy, you're saying MCS is primarily or only targeting services that have backends across more than one cluster. It is not it's not trying to address services that are not split across clusters.
No, it does that as well, in the same way that, but only with the same capabilities you get with service, right? Like you get a cluster IP. It's not intelligent. You don't get traffic shaping. You don't get any layer 7 routing capabilities. You get a cluster IP. So if all you want is cluster IP, is a cluster IP service that you can call from anywhere, MCS is just a much easier way to do that.
Okay. Yeah, I think let's let Donald continue through his use cases. But I think the key takeaway from what this discussion seemed to conclude was let me summarize this, and Jeremy, maybe you can say if that's an accurate summary. At least so far, the focus of MCS is on services with backend split across clusters. I mean, not that it cannot address services that are external services or services within a cluster, but those can be tackled through other means, including the gateway API. And you would perhaps like to see a stronger case if we want to extend MCS scope to include those services, because at the moment you're suggesting that those can be addressed via other means and not via MCS API.
That's correct, with the exception that we do see a lot of people using MCS for, like, I literally just exposing a layer 4 service in the cluster set. So just super trivial, simple exposure. But yes, I think the gateway API is a much more flexible surface for any configuration on top.
So one thing that the gateway API lacks is it does not do service advertisement, right? One benefit of the MCS API is you can export the service which you cannot do with Gateway API.
That's
So
very true.
Although, would there be a way of doing it with a specific gateway class? Is there, I mean, is an extension?
Yeah.
Has it been thought about?
I don't know how much it's been thought about, but that seems pretty reasonable. I guess what it comes down to is like MCS does all these things automatically because it has hard assumptions about how things work. Like the idea of being able to import some external service that doesn't otherwise adhere to namespace sameness with MCS, like somewhere we need to define that mapping and what that looks like, because we're explicitly saying we can't infer from the state of the service the information that MCS relies on. And that starts sounding like a very different, very useful, super important problem to solve, but a different problem than that which MCS is targeting.
well, today you can do that via just fall back on your DNS, right? If it's not
Right.
in your cluster set DNS, then it's in your global DNS, and then you can reach it.
Right.
But I think just to wrap up, going back on the Gateway API thing, I think these are not meant to solve the same problem. So even if Gateway API has a class that exports a L4 service, it is not doing service advertisement, which
Right.
is what MCS is doing. So maybe it would be useful to see MCS and Gateway as complementary, in that MCS can do service export for all services, regardless of domain name. And that's something that is more appropriate for MCS to do. And Gateway can do load balancing, but not export of services. I feel like these are two separate functions. MCS can be a more generic service export and discovery function, and Gateway can just handle the incoming traffic. Anyway.
Yeah, I think this probably needs more discussion, but I guess the concern is it like kind of again that just MCS is a narrow is a more narrow API and makes a lot of assumptions. And if we're saying that we want it to do more than that, I wonder if MCS is the right home for that. If what's missing on Gateway is service discovery or service advertisement, is there, Donald, you threw out the idea of like an extension. I think maybe that makes sense. Like maybe there's a way to say advertise this gateway versus like if because MCS doesn't only do advertisement, it's a piece of it. I wonder if it's really the right place for that to live. If we'd basically be saying don't do most of what MCS does, just do this service advertisement. And most of what MCS does would then be handled by Gateway. It seems like we're really stretching APIs there, which isn't to say we can't do that, but definitely needs further discussion.
My perspective is like some of the MCS, the concepts that MCS has introduced. So like the service export, service import, would be useful like in the shape of the Gateway API to do something like advertising catalog of services which could be selectively imported and consumed. So not the like north-south, but like Gateway API as the east-west case.
Right. Yeah. Also, I just want to throw out, there's absolutely nothing stopping you from like creating a service import that actually sits in front of it, like points at a gateway. I don't know, it's something that we want to encode in the spec, but it would work, definitely. You basically just gives you an IP with a name. Although this, encoding that in spec gets scary because then you start looking at like external name services, which have their own words. So
Jeremy, another thing is that Gateway API and its implementation is typically fairly heavyweight. You have a fairly complex L7 load balancer sitting there. If all you want to do is advertise, I'm not sure we should push service export to Gateway API.
Well, that's just the L7 gateway class, right? Like I think, yes, most gateway use cases today sit in front of some very heavy infrastructure, but I don't think that is at all a characteristic of the API. I think that's just what the use cases that drove the API are. I think like the API is pretty lightweight if you want it to be.
Okay, I think Donald, just keep going. I think we can.
Yeah,
we
sorry.
can
Yep.
come back to this.
Yeah, no, it's incredibly useful discussion, and I think this is where I was just starting to realize as I was reading more about Gateway that there's definite, meshing between what MCS is doing and what Gateway can do in future. So I think this is a conversation that we'll come back to.
As it
But-
happens, that is exactly what I was prototyping right now, using Gateway with backend reference of service import.
Yeah. So, but I do still feel that, well, I've put a lot of thought into whether or not we can move forward effectively with and retain namespace sameness. And there are a number of, cumbersome ways we could potentially do it. But it seems to me that from a simplicity perspective and from what expectations are in a relatively modestly sized cluster set, that having some degree of separation of namespace might be helpful. I think we've got one angle of that, which is that if a namespace doesn't exist in a cluster, then you won't import that namespace from exporting clusters. I think that expanding that to fully define what it means to have separate administrative control of export and import would be useful. And the obvious thing that stands out to me here is that if we happen to have the same namespaces but for different purposes, then an export in one will have an unfortunate effect of importing into the other, and that might be undesirable. And so that kind of led me to, well, the obvious way to kind of tackle some of that is just with some simple policy. And the policy would be around defining the behavior that you want for service import on the service, potentially on the service. I was initially thinking just on the service import side, but potentially also on the service export side, where import all is kind of the current behavior, import only from specific namespace, import with some form of namespace mapping to overcome existing namespace differences, and then no automatic import at all was kind of the layers of behavior that I could envisage. So I thought it'd be worth throwing that out there and seeing what people think.
Well, the original spec, the early draft, actually did have a mapping concept. And we backed it out because we wanted to try not to have that, not because it was like a don't ever do this, but one of the things that kind of kept coming up is like brownfield is a real problem with MCS. There's no question. If you bring existing clusters to MCS, work is required one way or another, and that's not ideal. The concern I keep coming back to, and this isn't to say like that we shouldn't keep having this discussion and maybe change what we're doing today, but optimizing for that transition from brownfield to MCS is certainly good. Onboarding people to MCS is great, but do we just kind of get in a situation where we prolong forever and we enable like a spaghetti cluster set where all the pieces kind of fit together in hard to map ways that actually make other administrative problems more difficult? The namespace sameness idea was always supposed to be bigger than MCS. Just like if we can make this assumption, all kinds of things get easier. Some things get harder, but we have a very straightforward answer to those hard things, which is like, it sounds like we're describing two separate namespaces and maybe they shouldn't have the same name. And so like, what is actually a better outcome? Is it that we alias namespaces so that you can bring my foo and your foo together? Or would everybody be better off if one of us renamed our foo to bar at the start? And yes, it's some lift, but then we don't have to worry about identity, access, and connectivity moving forward because we've kind of aligned things. And so it's, do we force a little bit of pain up front? And I certainly would prefer we didn't force any pain. But if we enable this, are we actually just leading to like prolonged pain for the life of the service at just to benefit a slightly easier onboarding? I do think selective, like don't opt in, like gradual opt-in to sameness is key, but at the same time, maybe you just don't get cluster set capabilities until you go through that opt-in for each namespace. But the starting place here was an alias, like import as, because we thought that would be easier, and then we did some deployments and created our own spaghetti and decided that, like, let's revisit this when there's a request, and certainly have a request right now.
Yeah, I can see that point of view, that for sure somewhere down the line you'll just end up with spaghetti. There's always that risk. It happens anywhere that you've got naming.
Right. Yeah.
And introducing another name of scoping, layer of scoping, sorry, doesn't seem like a solution to that problem.
And Jeremy, I think the other thing is that MCS can become a generic, in my view, service discovery API, if not, right? And I still feel like that something shouldn't be overloaded to give API. But in order to do that, it has to also address a non-Kubernetes clusters, which don't even have the concept of a namespace, or better brownfield. So if we want MCS to be like an enterprise-wide service discovery, it really cannot. I mean, especially like retail edge where thousands of clusters, right? You really cannot expect to have namespace sameness. So having an annotation, which is the alias, I mean, something like that could even work, right? Here's an annotation where this namespace is called foo, but really means its actual name is, foo prime, and then use foo prime as your alias.
Yeah, I'm just not sure MCS is the right place for a generic service discovery API. I mean, that is a problem for sure, but it's not necessarily a problem we went to set out. I think having a nice, easy way to, in a platform agnostic, with a platform agnostic API, expose services in Kubernetes that may not even live on Kubernetes is really useful. You could hack that into service import and that would work. But like MCS really set out to solve multi-cluster, not like cluster external. And I think they're different problem spaces. We could solve them with the same API. But I don't know that that would be the best solution for multi-cluster Kubernetes aware. Like one of the things that we wanted with MCS is that the services that you expose with MCS are actually like have the information you want with services. We had the policy conversation last meeting, like they have metadata on the endpoints so that you can, ideally they grow metadata on the endpoints so that you can have cluster network policy. There's information you have on endpoints in Kubernetes that you don't have for external things. And like MCS wants to enable Kubernetes clusters who know all about Kubernetes to consume services from other Kubernetes clusters with all the associated metadata, which is a very specialized part of service discovery. Whereas I think generic service discovery can be a lot more flexible and doesn't need nearly as much information, maybe is better as a different API.
Sure, except that there isn't any other good candidate currently in the CNCF ecosystem. Yeah,
but we could just make one. I mean, like it's the other thing is, I would really we have a bunch of MCS implementations, and this is actually what I want to talk about at the end. So I'll stop in a second, but there are a bunch of implementations now, and everything we're talking about with MCS seems to be additive. And I would really like to graduate MCS to beta, so we can call it GA and people can start relying on the base set while we figure out what we want to build on top and around it. I also think if MCS is beta and we have a simpler API that looks like MCS for generic service discovery, it'll probably be easier to just kind of move along with that, because a lot of we'll have that endorsement of the basic concepts. So I am very happy to explore service discovery in general, for sure. I think this is important. I'm just worried that this becomes the, you know, the infinite problem space, and we try to grow MCS too big, and we're perma alpha.
Yeah, interesting. I realize it's been in alpha for quite some time, so there is that desire to draw a line under the first version. Yeah, so just kind of wrapping up, I did have a couple more slides. One of which is that other aspects of, you know, things that could move towards this, and that is using labels and selectors as an alternative to relying on namespaces as the unit of policy enforcement. And then I know this is kind of somewhat out with MCS and much more like a Submariner implementation, or possibly some of the implementations that Google have for fleets, is that you actually have some kind of active broker or control cluster that decides what gets shared where. Would give you more control over things. And a consequence of, obviously, if you don't have namespace sameness, is that then if you actually want service equivalence from exporting clusters, then you may need some kind of label to identify services as being equivalent when they don't have a matching namespace pair, which is obviously one of the challenges that comes up if you break the namespace sameness rule. I'm very conscious that this overlaps with multi-cluster policy, with multi-cluster load balancing, as we've been talking about, with gateway, and with the concept and definition of what even is a hybrid control plane. And that was going to be one of my wrap-up questions, is there any work in defining what a hybrid control plane means from a multi-cluster perspective? And is that something we should be moving forward in this forum?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the answer right now is no. Well, to the first question, is there any work going on? I think should we move ahead in this forum? Absolutely. I think like the history of SIG multicluster started with basically trying to define like the cluster registry and all of those pieces, and it's too broad. So with MCS, we wanted to step back and start with something very purpose-built to solve problems that we know everybody has. I think at some point, a control plane API is going to emerge from having a few different multi-cluster APIs that need coordination. Yeah, this is maybe we're just seeing that it's getting close to that time.
Because even just in the simple policy proposal for how to declare what you want imported, it clearly overlaps with stuff that Sanjeev's already looking at for multi-cluster policy from a load balancing perspective, et cetera, et cetera. And obviously this would impact on multi-cluster network policy, which nobody's even really, well, sorry, Andrew is probably pushing in a different context. So yeah, it's definitely, it's open for further discussion. And I guess we'd all like to be involved. There's quite a crowd of us on this.
And we had Sanjeev start the multi-cluster network policy as well conversation. Yep. So this is probably something that needs further discussion. I think there's a lot of really good points and gaps here that we need to solve. I guess
I suspect it doesn't help us solve our immediate problem, which is bumping up against namespace sameness.
Yeah, well, so I've kind of always thought of MCS as being an API that serves two different groups. They need to work together, but one role is not really interacting with both sides, right? There's the consumer who just cares that the service is exposed to them and their application can consume it. They may care where it comes from, but frankly, I don't think that's their role. I think that's more the role of, you know, the platform administrator, the service owner, to make sure it gets to the right places. But like if a service is imported to me as foo, I don't really care if it was originally named bar. I just care that it's now named foo, and somebody made the decision that that is a good identity for it, and someone I can trust made that decision. and I can consume it. On the exporting side, you just want to make sure that your services get exposed. Like, I don't really want to open this can of worms too much, but I think that there's like a case for an implementation deciding to support a not necessarily standard mapping in to support brownfield or for edge cases, because most users of the MCS API live on either the exporting or the importing side for a given service. They're not necessarily concerned with making sure their exports and imports always line up. Like, I want my service to be exposed to everyone in my cluster set is a decision I make as a service owner. I'm not consuming my service as a service owner, somebody else is. That's not entirely true when you have a multi-cluster application and it's all one team, and you do want that local exposure. Like, I want my service to spill across a couple clusters for failover, but it's only consumed by a front end by the same team. But that actually doesn't seem very likely to bump up against namespace sameness, because you're talking about a team as a unit here. So all this to say that, kind of getting to the topic I wanted to bring up today, I think actually this is really helpful in that is, like, we have a bunch of problems in this space. I think there's a lot of future discussion that we need to have around this deck. Thank you, Donald. This is really good. What I'm not seeing here is anything that actually, like, anything that wouldn't be an add-on to MCS. I'm not seeing anything that suggests that the MCS API isn't a fine starting place. Like, if we have an import policy, it would live above MCS. If we added selectors, that would be something we extend the MCS API with. To the earlier statement that we've been in alpha for way too long now, is there any reason not to graduate what we have with the knowledge that, any future changes need to be backwards compatible? But I think it's fine that, if we added an alias field, for example, like, there's no risk that if you don't use that, things continue to work the way they always have. Is there anything that with the current API we want to remove before we go GA? Because I think exceptions to namespace sameness, for example, can be add-ons. I think it's still a good place to start. If you don't configure anything, just start with namespace sameness.
So yes, I agree that namespace non-sameness can be an add-on starting with namespace sameness. But one thing that I sense is kind of not good with the current API, separate topic, is almost slightly artificial separation of service and service import. So for example, in Gateway API, we are suggesting that if the backend reference is service, then you're load balancing within the cluster. If the backend service is service import, then you're load balancing across the entire global service. That requires applications to change their manifests from service to service import. Ideally, a service import should automatically create services so that applications can treat services and service imports the same. That's not possible. That doesn't work very cleanly with the current API. So I don't know if I'm saying this right, but applications have to change the DNS from cluster set local to cluster local to cluster set local, going from a unicluster application to a multi-cluster application. That's not great. And the second thing is the slightly artificial separation between service and service import. You have to explicitly change to service import to make it multi-cluster.
So this is an area we spent a lot of time discussing, and the feedback was split for sure, but the consensus was that in general, in most cases, that split is desirable, because you don't you normally don't want your service to just spread across clusters or become global, or maybe head to a more expensive destination without some kind of awareness that this could happen. And so that's where we said that just overriding cluster local, which other platforms have decided to do in the past, can cause problems when all of a sudden you're spraying traffic across regions and you didn't know that was even an option. And so opting in is a safer approach.
But opting to, so 2 points on that. One is opting in could have been done by retaining, let's say, cluster local, or let's say retaining service object instead of the service import, but having an additional field in the service object saying, oh, by the way, this service actually is a multi-cluster service. So just extending the service.
There is very little appetite for extending service. That's the other piece here, because we actually did start with like, what if we labeled services? What if we just labeled service? But service right now is kind of a mess, right? It does way too much. Aside from the whole headless cluster IP, like these are unrelated concepts essentially that are exposed through the same resource. And then we have node port, and then we have load balancer, and then we have external name. There's a few there that do kind of build on each other. And then there's a few that have almost nothing to do with each other, except they also rely on a pod selector. So like and part of Gateway, which I think was originally named Service V2, is like trying not to keep sticking things on services and start making it more composable. So, like, yes, service export is another resource that in many cases could just be a label, but it's also, a very like, you can stick your service export in the same file as your service if you want. And now it's nice and easy to list all your exposed services. And we don't have to extend service, I think, which is actually a pro, because service is a big mess.
I think with the description of what you've made there and the comparison to Gateway, the obvious missing piece is service class.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
another reason I mentioned that is because I'm getting some comments on the multi-cluster network policy draft, which are suggesting to go the other way, which is saying, instead of using a service import selector, why don't you just use a service selector so that it applies both to unicluster services and multi-cluster services. So Tim was actually suggesting in some cases, just use service selector, not a service import selector. So, and the reason I put service import there is to align with Gateway API, because Gateway API differentiates between service backends and service import backends.
Yeah, we also talked with Gateway about having the selector just apply to both. I think, that's a point of alignment with Gateway. Like it would be easy enough to say select all services or service imports. I agree that it doesn't seem entirely necessary to have specific selectors for service imports and services when you're running in a cluster controlled by that's owned by one group. You can make statements there. I don't have a real strong opinion that way. Gateway went for the separate selectors. I think network policy should align with Gateway, regardless of the choice. But I don't think that necessarily precludes having a separate service import. The other thing is that like things use services today, and using a service import may not always be, like using a multi-cluster service may not always be safe. So, it's a lot easier to have that separation and extend things to be multi-cluster aware than it is to guarantee that a multi-cluster service won't just start breaking service aware controllers.
Yeah, we'll have to resolve that, because at least Tim had some comments about unifying service imports and services for policy.
Yeah, we should dig into that, because Tim has been involved in this for API for a long time. So I'm curious where he's coming from there. But yeah, that would be a good follow-up.
I guess from what I was presenting in answer to your question, if we can work on extensions that can do aliasing, for example, but let MCS 1.0 graduate, that works for me from the perspective of namespaces. The one area that I've always had a concern is the opt-in with cluster set.local DNS suffix, because that requires reconfiguring your workloads to choose. I understand the reasoning that better make it opt-in rather than surprisingly get remote traffic when you weren't expecting it. But that's an area where I'm scared. There's no right answer.
Could that be an extension as well? Well, so there's the interface, ignoring practicality.
Ignoring the practicality of how you actually do delegation of DNS lookups. Yes.
Right, but could we have an option to like? I don't see why we couldn't add an option to at the API level to say that service import should in fact just override cluster local as well. There are services in the multi-cluster space that do this. Istio is one that already kind of takes over cluster local. Now, mechanically, MCS is an API with no implementation, right? We have a bunch of implementations, but there's no like in-tree implementation. Mandating this would be really hard, mandating this behavior and including it as part of the core spec, because Core DNS, Kube DNS already work the way they do. And we would basically be saying you have to use multi-cluster services, you have to replace infrastructure you're relying on today, because these things are not going to just replace cluster local. Like cluster local will not extend to multi-cluster services the way it's been built today. Like Kube DNS would need to be aware, Core DNS would need to be aware.
Yeah.
And
what would break if you fronted service with a service? Out of curiosity.
Yeah. If you
that's a blunt way of aliasing.
Yeah, if you nothing, some things will get slower. I think it would normally work. Mechanically, implementations do this, so it's not a problem, but they don't front it with the same service. So the big problem there is since the service is untouched that's exporting the single cluster, if you were to import as the service with the same name to take it over, how do you actually handle the case where a cluster both exports and imports? Yeah. That's the problem we haven't really been able to wrap our heads around. So even if we made it cluster local, we might want to make it cluster local with a different name, which doesn't solve the fact that you have to change your configuration opt-in, which is not ideal. And why we kind of go with the message that, hey, maybe just start with multi-cluster services from day one, so you don't have to worry about this opt-in. Even if you're only cluster local, there's nothing like multi-cluster services can be cluster local. That's not a perfect answer, because a lot of people are using Kubernetes and day one is long past. So, that's difficult, but I always worry about optimizing for the transition at the expense of the long term.
Yeah. Agreed. Something to think on more, I think, actually, from what you've laid out there.
Also, have people raised the issue of tying the cluster set membership to physical clusters, meaning that maybe having more like logical clusters be part of the cluster set, and a physical cluster can consist of multiple logical clusters, so that you can have physical cluster A has got logical cluster A.1, which has these namespaces, and logical cluster A.2, which has these other namespaces. So you can maintain your namespace sameness, but you decouple it from the physical cluster. And then you can create these partially overlapping cluster sets while retaining namespace sameness, because you see where I'm going.
Yeah, so the problem there is that namespace sameness becomes transitive, but awareness of other namespaces doesn't, right? Like if you have namespaces 1 through 3 are in this cluster set over here, and namespaces 4 through 6 are in this cluster set over here, you still can never create namespace 1 in this cluster set, right? Because the joint cluster has them both. But this cluster set actually doesn't know namespace 1 exists. And so you might just want them to all be connected and then have network policy that says this can't talk to namespace 1.
Yeah.
And it's not perfect. We definitely have people saying like, well, what if I want to stitch cluster sets together? And so the blanket answer has been Gateway, but I don't think we have like solid community best practices for exactly how, which probably should accompany that if that's the answer.
Yeah, I mean, Gateway has been mainly looking at it as Ingress V2. Really, it's just load balancing. It's really not talking about these cross service discovery type stuff. But yeah.
Not yet, but I think there's definitely potential for it to eventually expand into that space.
I agree. I think Gateway is designed to be a lot more flexible and have a lot more room for growth than MCS. Like MCS is kind of the opposite. MCS is super opinionated and simple, whereas Gateway is a lot less opinionated and a lot more flexible. But I imagine that advanced use cases with Gateway are going to they're going to have a learning curve. Like with MCS, we specifically wanted no learning curve. Like just make your service multi-cluster, but obviously this has caused problems. We are out of time today, and so I want to respect everyone who's got other meetings after this. But this has been an amazing conversation. Maybe we can continue this in 2 weeks with some more thought. I think this is really a really good topic. I know that Laura, who wasn't able to make it today, is going to be putting together some final notes on hopefully graduating both MCS and the cluster property proposal to beta in the next week or so. So if anyone, we'll make sure that gets sent out to the mailing list. But if anyone has any comments there, please join in. But hopefully we can continue this conversation, because I think there's some really good points brought up here and some problems we need to solve, which is kind of what the SIG is looking for next. Anyway, so yeah, maybe we can regroup in 2 weeks and keep this going.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. And thanks, Donald, for the slides and the awesome discussion today.
Thanks, everyone.
See ya.